Kira and welcome to another video. Today I'm really looking forward to talking to you about the 5 best books that I read during lockdown. Here in the UK, our really strict lockdown lasted between the months of March and June, and now that we're in July, we are slightly easing back into some kind of normality, so we're not quite in such a strict lockdown. So for the purposes of this video, I have selected books from that period between March and June, which for me was a really great time for reading. I think like a lot of people, I finally had a lot more downtime than I ever normally would have. And when you take out the busyness of course, going to work, working a full-time job, going out to meet people, socialising, going to cafes, doing pretty much anything outside of the house, you find that you suddenly have a lot more downtime, and that is a really great time to do some more reading. So like a lot of readers, I ended up reading a lot more during that period than I think I normally would have, and honestly, I picked some great books up during that time. As well as, of course, reading more, I also spent more time watching YouTube and listening to other people's book recommendations, so I really do feel like that quarantine and lockdown period not only encouraged me just to read more books, but also to kind of spread my wings and go a little bit out of my reading comfort zone. And I feel like I really explored some new genres, tried out new things, read books I maybe otherwise wouldn't have, and honestly I feel like I found some incredible new favourites. Without even trying to, the 5 books that I've picked up are all from very different genres and styles. I have a classic, a non-fiction, a contemporary romance, a dark academia, and also a magical realism / urban fantasy style book. And so I feel like that really goes to show the diversity of what I was reading during that period. I really delved into all kinds of genres, tried out new things, and found some incredible books. So these books are not in any particular order, but they are the 5 best books that I feel like I picked up during the quarantine lockdown period. And honestly, whilst they are my favourite books from this time of the year, I also feel like some of these will definitely be making a reappearance in my end of year favourites as well, because they were just so good. So without further ado, let's jump into my first lockdown favourite. And this is actually one of the books that I read right at the beginning of lockdown, towards the end of March and the beginning of April. And I remember sitting in the garden, enjoying the glorious weather that we got at the end of spring this year, and honestly just having a great time sitting in the garden, reading and enjoying the wonderful weather. And that book was Emma by Jane Austen. So far, this is my favourite Austen novel that I've read. I've now read 5 of the 6 and I still have Mansfield Park left to read, so I'm reluctant to say this is my ultimate favourite Austen novel because who knows, Mansfield Park may be absolutely incredible, but I have a sneaking suspicion that this one is still going to be my favourite because I just loved it so much. This is, I would argue, the funniest classic that I've ever read, and Jane Austen in general does an incredible job of really putting tropes on their head, making fun of what was common in literature at the time, and just sort of having a great time sort of exploring things in a slightly different way. And so this is a romance book, but it definitely doesn't take the format of what you maybe would expect from a romance of this era. So as the title would suggest, our protagonist in this book is called Emma. Emma is our young protagonist. She's about 21 years old, and she is also from a very rich family. Her father is a widow, so Emma lives with her dad, and her older sister already has left the family and has gotten married. And so Emma is, at 21 years old, a very powerful woman because she is the mistress of her dad's house. She has a lot of power, a lot of freedom, and she is completely doted upon by her dad as well. He thinks that she's like the best person ever, and she also has a relatively inflated ego because she also thinks that she's quite great. Emma is, for the most part, a very well-liked character. She's liked by a lot of the other people that we encounter in this book and all of the other people in the village and town that they live in. However, she's also a little bit of a conceited and judgmental person. She has her prejudices, she judges people, she doesn't like people for no reason other than that she's a little bit jealous of them, or she just doesn't really get on with them. And so Emma is a flawed character, which is why I think I have found this book to be such an incredible classic. I feel like females in classics can often just be so perfect and so moral and just very unbelievable, whereas Emma is a great character. She's clever, she's funny, she's well liked, but she also has her flaws, and that just makes her seem immediately more realistic and immediately more relatable to you as a reader. The frame of this book essentially sets Emma up as a matchmaker because of the fact that she is so wealthy and is living such a life of freedom, she doesn't really have marriage on her brain. It's not something that she's particularly bothered about because she doesn't need to. She doesn't need to marry someone for a sort of like up in society. She already has a great position, and so marriage for her just doesn't seem like that attractive of a prospect because she would be leaving her already incredible life of comfort. And so instead of focusing on marriage and relationships in terms of trying to find a suitable partner for herself, Emma then busies herself with trying to become a matchmaker and set other people up, but she is a matchmaker who makes a lot of mistakes and causes people a lot of trouble that probably wouldn't have happened if she'd have just left them to their own devices. And so it's a really, really funny book which really explores that matchmaking quality, but I feel like matchmakers in these books are usually like older, widowed women, and so it's really interesting to have it as a young, very eligible like girl who could go off and get married if she wanted to, but instead she sort of chosen to take a back seat. And whilst romance does sort of take Emma up at some point in the book, it's not necessarily the primary focus, and I think it's interesting that Jane Austen explores that sort of societal divide where marriage is either something that you need to do in order to get by and in order to survive, and how it can often be a very political decision, and then how you have these characters and females who are from very rich families who don't necessarily need to look at marriage in that way. So she explores all of these really, really interesting bits of social commentary and explores how marriage is a really interesting institution at this time and isn't necessarily what we have come to view it now in modern romances as just something that is a decision based on love. It was a much more calculated thing back then, and I feel like Jane Austen does a great job of exploring that with also having a really, really funny protagonist. So overall, I absolutely loved this book. It was incredible, and not only just my favourite Austen so far, but I'd say up there with my favourite classics because I just enjoyed reading it so much. So whilst we are on the topic of romance, I might as well talk about my favourite contemporary romance that I read during this lockdown period. Contemporary romance, I would say, is one of my least read genres. I don't necessarily always find myself gravitating towards it, but this one in particular really caught my attention, and I'm so glad that it did because I enjoyed it so much. It was a really, really good book, and for that reason I actually don't even have my copy with me because I've already lent it out to my mum. I just want everyone to read this book because I loved it so much, and so you'll have to make do with just a picture of the cover here on the screen because, like I said, I don't have mine with me, but the book that I'm talking about is The Two Lives of Lydia Bird by Josie Silver. Now this is without a doubt a contemporary romance, but it definitely does have a little bit of a twist, and I'd say commonly whenever I do gravitate towards a romance, it's one that seems to have a little bit of a twist and doesn't necessarily follow that classic romance trajectory of just like boy meets girl. I like something with a little bit more depth to it than that. No judgment to any books that are that sort of format, but it's just not something that I gravitate towards that much myself. And so in this instance, The Two Lives of Lydia Bird is a book which is split into two chapter styles titled Asleep and Awake. The reason for this is that at the very beginning of the book, our protagonist Lydia is living a pretty idealistic life. She's engaged to the love of her life, her boyfriend Freddie, who she's been with for 10 years. They met in school, childhood sweethearts, and they're basically living an ideal life. But then on his way to meet Lydia for her birthday dinner, Freddie is in a car accident and passes away very, very suddenly. And so at this point, Lydia's life is split in two. She kind of has her life where she's asleep and her life where she's awake. And this is because in her grief and in her struggle to deal with what has happened to Freddie, her doctor prescribes her some sleeping pills because she's really struggling to sleep and is becoming exhausted with grief. And when she takes these sleeping pills, she's transported into a world where it seems as if Freddie is still alive and everything is moving along in the trajectory that she had imagined. So they're still engaged, they go for her birthday meal, they move on, they're engaged, they're getting married, planning the wedding, all of that stuff. Everything is going exactly as she thought it would. And then of course, when she's awake, she's having to face the reality of grief, trying to carve out a life for herself and figure out what she's going to do because of course everything that she had planned and imagined for her future is now flipped on its head and is missing such a key part in her partner. And so at first Lydia becomes really, really invested in these sleeping pills because they give her what she wants, the one thing that she wants, which is that Freddie is still alive. However, she slowly starts to realise that in the more time that she's spending in this world asleep, the less she is invested in her real life and the less she is able to actually come to terms with her grief and move on with her life and find her new path. And so she gradually has to start kind of weaning herself away from this asleep life and figuring out what she wants to do with her real life. I found this book to be so impactful in the way that it dealt with grief. It really showed how desperate she was for the reality that she'd imagined to be real and for her sleep life to be the real life that she was experiencing, and her gradual sort of reluctance to come to terms with what was actually going on in her reality. There was also an interesting exploration of her relationships with her friends and family, and how people don't necessarily understand the experience of grief unless they're going through it themselves. And so whilst people were really, really sympathetic and sort of supportive of her to begin with, they don't necessarily imagine how long and how up and down the process of grief could be. And so whilst Lydia is still several months on really, really struggling and dealing with setbacks, they don't necessarily understand that and have come to move on themselves, and so they just don't empathise with that experience of grief. And I feel like Josie Silver just did such an incredible job of exploring the raw and real experience of grief, and exploring how it wasn't necessarily a linear experience and was very up and down. This was a book which had romance elements sort of weaved in with it, but it was also an experience of sort of self-growth, I would say, as Lydia had to learn how to become Lydia on her own and be happy in and of herself and not just happy in her relationship. And I just thought this was such an interesting way to explore grief by having these asleep and awake chapters, and just showing Lydia's growth and journey as she comes to accept what has happened and move on, changed of course by what had happened, but still managing to find a life for herself that makes her happy. And so as someone, like I said, who doesn't read a great deal of romance, I found this one to be so impactful. I read it in like a day and it was just such a great book. I really, really loved it. And I'm now so excited to read Josie Silver's other book. The Two Lives of Lydia Bird was her second book, and she had a book that came out at the end of last year called One Day in December, I think. And I'm really excited to read that this Christmas time because I just loved her writing style, and I do feel like I just love that style of romance, so I definitely want to read more of it. So next up we have a book which I would say is a little bit more my usual style and what I would usually go for, and that is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This is of course a dark academia and I absolutely loved it. However, I do feel like having read this book, I'm now just judging every single other dark academia that I read by this standard because it was so incredible. I feel like I was quite late to the train with this one, and a lot of people have already read this book, so I don't know how much of an explanation I really need to give. It is such a popular book. However, it's also one that's very divisive, and I see people either loving it or hating it. Now, I personally loved it for quite a few reasons. So first of all, I'll just give a quick summary. In this book, we're following our main character, Richard, who is from California. He's not from a very well-off family, and he doesn't necessarily get on with his parents, but he really wants to pursue academia, and so he goes out of his way to try and find a place at a New England college, and he goes all the way from California to New England, and there he is kind of initiated into this world which is so different from anything he's ever experienced. Once he's there, he ends up joining a class which is run by a very elite classics professor, and this professor does things in a very interesting way. He only teaches a very small group of students at any one time, and those students are not allowed to have any other teachers. He teaches them everything and does their entire curriculum, and they have this very tight-knit group community because they only really associate with and socialize with each other. The group is made up of some very interesting characters, and what we're told at the very beginning of the book is that a murder takes place. So we know right from the start of the book that this murder is going to take place, and then the book kind of shifts back in time and gives you all of the context leading up to the moment of the murder, and then also what happens in the aftermath and what follows the murder. And so it's really interesting to go into this book knowing that a murder is going to take place and knowing what happens, but not knowing what leads the characters to that point and then what happens to them afterwards. And so we have this very cult-like society of students who are all studying classics. They're all very close to one another, and then we have this really dramatic event, but we don't know what's happening and why it happens or what happens afterwards. And so it's a very compelling book. It's very slow paced though. So of course you go in knowing what the key event of the book is, but then you don't know what's going to take you there, and it does take quite a while to get up to that point, and so it's very slow paced. And I'd say this is by far a more character focused book than it is plot focused. There are certainly very interesting plot points, but it's really about the characters and their interactions with one another and how these relationships change, develop, and ultimately break down, leading to this murder. And so it's a really slow paced book, but I personally love these slow burn books where you really intricately and intimately get to know the characters. And so it was really interesting. There's such a lovely New England academic aesthetic to this book, which is of course to be expected from a dark academia, and I just found it to be a really, really compelling book. I can understand why some people wouldn't necessarily be compelled by it, because some people just don't really like slow burn character-y books, but for me that is ideal and I absolutely love those types of books, so I cannot recommend this book highly enough. It's just so incredible, and I feel like although I read this actually in the springtime, it would be a perfect autumnal Halloweeny read just because of the dark aesthetic and vibe that this book gives off. But overall, I just recommend reading it at any time, to be honest, because it was just such a great book. So next up we have the non-fiction book, which I loved during lockdown, and to be perfectly honest, non-fiction is a genre that I really haven't read that much of. It's something that I definitely want to change, and reading this book has really motivated me to want to read more non-fiction because I enjoyed it so much. So hopefully that is something that I'll be featuring more on the channel going forward, because I do definitely want to read more non-fiction. But the one that I read in lockdown, which was just incredible, was Educated by Tara Westover. This is a memoir, and I feel like for me, memoir will be the ideal entryway into non-fiction because it allows you to read something that is based on reality and is of course non-fiction, but being told in the memoir format gives it a story-like quality that just makes it a lot easier to bridge that gap between people who are used to reading fiction but want to get into more non-fiction. So I feel like this will be a great entryway, and I'll hopefully be reading some more memoirs. So if you do have any memoir recommendations, please leave them down below because I'd love to check them out. But moving back onto this one, I loved it so much. This book was nothing like what I expected in so many incredible ways, and all in all, it was just such a good book. This is a book which, of course, as a memoir, tells the story of a woman called Tara Westover, right from her childhood up until the present day as an adult. And Tara was born into a very, very cult-like family who were extremely religious Mormons, and they were preppers. So they were preparing all of the time for the end of the world and believed that they couldn't interact with the government or any mainstream government-funded services because they associated the government with the devil. So they believed that they needed to be completely self-sufficient and prepare for the end of the world, essentially. And for this reason, they had 7 children, and only 3 of those children were registered. The 4 younger children, and I think Tara was the youngest of all of the children, weren't registered at all. Their births were not recorded by the government. They therefore didn't go to school. They didn't have any access to medical services. They obviously weren't covered by any insurance, and they lived a very, very sheltered and secluded lifestyle for this reason. So naturally, as a child, Tara didn't have any understanding of the world outside of her family or outside of the view that her parents explored and told to her, because of course she was a child and had no access to any other view of the world. And so she just went along with this way of life. But gradually, as she got older, she became more and more involved with the outside world, and despite not wanting to leave her parents or go against their worldview, she did start questioning what was going on and started to explore the possibility that there might be another way to view the world and another way to go about living her life. Now, having read the synopsis of this book, I had expected this to be about a girl who was born into a cult-like family, which was true, and I expected her to go to the age of about 16, leave the family, move on, get out of the cult, and just live her life. And that was so far from the truth, because what this book explored was how long of a process it was for Tara to figure out what she wanted to do, whether or not she wanted to leave the way of life that her parents had set out for her, and how she could really possibly go about doing that. Before going into this book, I hadn't really anticipated or appreciated the difficulty of leaving a cult. Obviously, I still can't truly appreciate it because I've never done it. However, this book really did explore how it's never just as simple as saying, yeah, I'm gonna leave. She was so emotionally tied to her family, of course. They were her family and all she had ever known. And she was also educationally tied to them. They had formed her first worldview. And so trying to understand how to view the world as differently to the family was such a long task for her. And it was really a process of education, as the title of the book would suggest. And so we see Tara go on this incredible journey as she tries to figure out how she wants to view the world and starts to unpick what she's been told by her parents and then marry that up with what she's now being told by professors, friends, university teachers, and all of that stuff. And then through these two opposing views, try and figure out what her individual point is and try and take that sense of ownership of her own worldview. So it showed the complexities of leaving this cult-like situation and how complex and how long of a process it was, but it also explored her education and the power that she sort of had within herself all of this time to carve a different path for herself. And we see her go on to be an extremely successful person, and it's just such an incredibly empowering story, which really explores how when you sort of do figure out what you want to do with your life, you can sort of achieve whatever you want to achieve. And of course it's all contextual and really depends on your independent situation, but Tara came from such a radical background that the future that she has carved out for herself is just all the more incredible for it. But something else I found really surprising about this book was how much empathy and sadness, to be honest, that you end up feeling for Tara's family. Again, the blurb of this book, which I found to be kind of misleading and definitely set me up for expectations that were not what the book was about whatsoever, really sort of portrays her parents and her brother as extremely radical and extremely abusive. And whilst this is true, I feel like once again, my expectations for what I was going to feel towards these family members and what I actually felt was very different based on the way that Tara presented them. She is of course their family member, and despite disagreeing with a lot of things that they do, she also feels emotionally connected to them and does of course love them as her parents, as her brothers, and all of that stuff. And so we understand through Tara that her parents, particularly her father, who have kind of led the family down this path, are of course dealing with mental illness. And through this understanding, we can then come to sort of really empathize with her dad, because you understand that he is so misguided, and that through his own experiences with mental illness, he has done what he believes is for the best, and yet this has taken his entire family down such a terrible path and has led people like Tara to have to come up with some terrible decisions and cut ties with family members because she had no other choice. And yet she still feels that empathy towards them because she recognizes that it wasn't someone in necessarily a sort of right state of mind that had done these things. And so whilst you completely disagree with everything that they do to her, you can then feel a sense of empathy, which I certainly didn't expect to feel. There was one part of the book which I found to be really surprisingly emotional, and this was when Tara had decided to go across the world to study abroad, and her parents really didn't want her to do this because they felt like it was going against what was right. But at the airport, her dad basically said to her that they'd been storing fuel under the house because they were expecting the end of days to come, and they were prepping so that they wouldn't die and that they'd be able to stay alive for as long as possible independently. And he basically tried to encourage her not to go across the world because he said it doesn't matter where they are in America, they can come and get her and save her if the end of the world comes. But as soon as she goes across the sea, they can't come and get her. And I'm getting emotional just talking about that because obviously as a reader and as Tara, you know that that's not true. But you see in that statement that her dad is just trying to do what he thinks is best for the family, and he's so misguided and clearly dealing with mental illness, and that just made me feel so emotional because he just really wanted to protect them, but his way of doing that was so misguided. So I found this book to be so eye-opening. It really explored such a unique life experience that is, very unlike anything I'd ever come across before, and I think Tara did such an incredible way of exploring it objectively because she of course was so emotionally tied to these experiences and could have so easily just hated her family for what they've done to her, but instead she really did explore an objective experience and her journey of education, and it was amazing. So the fifth and final book that I'm going to be talking to you about is one which I ultimately struggle to categorize. I did describe it as an urban fantasy / magical realism, but it's also a historical fiction or a historical fantasy, and essentially it bridges all kinds of different genres. So instead of trying to figure out what to categorize it as, I'm just going to let this incredible book do the talking all for itself, and this book is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I finally read this book at the beginning of June, and I'm so glad that I did because it's a book that's been on my radar for a really long time. I think I first heard of this book through Hannah from the channel A Clockwork Reader. It's one of her all-time favourite books, and since then I've just always heard people talking about it with such high praises, and for the most part every single person that I heard talking about this book, bar maybe one or two, really loves it and just has such an incredible reading experience. But although I'd heard so many positive things about it, I think I'd never really felt fully motivated to pick the book up because people always talk about it in terms of the experience that you feel as a reader and how the book makes you feel, which is of course incredible. But because people don't really talk in very great detail about the plot, I just never really felt called to pick it up. But eventually, due to a readathon that was taking place at the beginning of June, which was the Make Your Myth Taker readathon, which is run by Charlotte and Ashley, I had to read a book which was reading one of the host's favourites. And one of the favourites on the list that you could choose from was Ashley's favourite, and it was The Night Circus. So I finally got around to reading it, and honestly, it was so good, so I'm really glad that I did. This book is hard to categorise, as I've already mentioned, and now that I've read it for myself, I can see why people do sort of explain this book and talk about it in terms of how you feel as a reader, because it is a very uniquely immersive and vivid reading experience that was kind of unlike anything I've ever read before. The book takes place over quite a long period of time. It starts in the mid-1800s and goes up until the early 1900s, so we follow characters over a really long period of time and really get to know them quite well, which I personally really like and always makes for a good book in my opinion. But of course, as the title would suggest, this book is about a circus which takes place at night time. So the Night Circus is the unique and just most interesting circus that you'll ever come across, both as a reader and if you ever go to a real circus, because it's just such a unique experience and idea. The Night Circus turns up at any given place without warning, just shows up, doesn't have any particular length of duration that it will stay for, it just crops up and you can go and enjoy it. You can only go between the hours of dusk and dawn, so when it's nighttime, no one can be there during daylight hours, and that is essentially the premise for the Night Circus. What is inside the gates of the circus is the most immersive, unique and magical experience that you'll ever come across. The circus is fueled by magic, and it is just a really unique concept. So as a reader, when you're reading about the circus, you genuinely do feel as though you've had the opportunity to go yourself, and you feel like you've been immersed in the world of the Night Circus and that you finally got to experience it, and it does just feel so captivating. So that is probably the main thing that makes this book so incredible. But then aside from that, we're also following a magical competition that's taking place between two of our main characters, Celia and Marco. However, both to Celia and Marco, the competitors in this competition, and to us as readers, this competition is a complete mystery. The aim of the competition, and crucially how you win it, is a complete mystery to everyone involved. And so there's this ongoing competition, this also an ongoing source of mystery, because really no one knows what's happening. But this competition and the magic it creates is what fuels the Night Circus, and so these things are intrinsically connected and yet ultimately mysterious. As well as following characters over a really long period of time, we also get an insight into quite a few different characters. We get to meet the people who are responsible for creating this magical competition. We see the people who come up with the ideas of the Night Circus. We get to, of course, see an insight into Celia, into Marco, into both sides of the competition, and really interestingly, we also get the perspective of some people who are just visitors to the circus and are just spectators, which I just think is really interesting. And by having all of these different chapters that give you perspectives into so many different people's experiences to do with the Night Circus, you just get such an immersive and rounded experience of the circus as a reader. Immersive, vivid, captivating and compelling are the words that jump up when I think of how I want to describe this book, because it is just that. It is such a vivid and interesting reading experience, and honestly it was just magical. And there are so many things to say about this book and so many things that I just feel like words can't even cover, because it just was such a uniquely immersive and captivating reading experience, which I loved. So there we have it. Those are the 5 best books that I read throughout the quarantine and lockdown period. And honestly, they were just scratching the surface, because I read so many incredible books throughout this lockdown period, but they were definitely my 5 favourites, and I just had a great time reading essentially. So as we're coming back out of lockdown and probably reading paces are going to be slowing down and we're going to be going back into some kind of normality, I'd love it if you could let me know down in the comments down below what was your favourite book that you read during the lockdown period, and whether or not you managed to do more reading than normal. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.